Well, we're going to be talking about a lot of different concerns that have been raised about this, but one of the probably most discussed areas is the housing problem. How is this going to potentially affect housing here? What's being done to accommodate the thousands of people that could be relocated here if this group is home ported?
Well, thank you, Lynn. When we got our request for the proposal from the Navy, the original letter specified and spelled out that they anticipated they would have a requirement for something on the order of 1,140 additional housing units, whereas we had originally thought that we might be looking at a requirement for 3,000 to 4,000. It turns out that requirement was over a period of 4 to 5 years for the military on the whole throughout the island. But the actual Battleship Surface Action Group requirement was something like 1,140 housing units. And if you look at the total number of military people on the island, there are about 20,000 housing units currently on military bases. There are about 6,000 military families who find their housing either through purchase or through rental units out in the community. So this additional impact of 1,140 wasn't really a serious consideration because our housing committee was able to turn up a number of options on how we were prepared to address that particular concern and solve the problem.
What are some of the options?
Well, there are about 5 different options that we included in our proposal. A couple of the ones that we look at as being most attractive and we think we'll be able to address and put on the forefront most quickly are working with the city and county through a new program under law now called the Industrial Development Revenue Bonds, where the city and county actually is able to float a revenue bond which will allow a private developer to step forward and build single-family or multifamily rental housing units on private land at a much quicker pace than has been happening in the past through the uniqueness of this particular bond issue. So that was one of the ways. We also have been in very close contact with the military through the Oahu Community Housing Family Office under control by the Army, and they are also looking at their particular requirements of building more housing for the military as a whole to include the additional requirements for the Navy group.
Okay, I want to remind everybody that's watching, we are live right now. If you have a question about home porting a battleship group here, what all it would entail, or if you have a comment about it, please call us 955-7878.
I think what Roy is indicating is that our particular assignment as the task force was not requested to address that particular, if it were a concern, or I'm sure it is a concern on your side. We had a number of parameters that we were asked to address to respond to a specific proposal. So when the volunteer group and the retired federal civil service employees got together, we had a definitive list of questions and parameters that we were asked to address. And we were not in a position to go back to the Navy and say, well, what kind of armaments are you going to have? What is going to be the troop force? All the rest of these numbers were not really of our particular concern. So we have these inherent concerns ourselves, but our particular assignment was, what can we do to address the problems that the Navy had when they were considering where to go with their battleship group, whether it is San Francisco, Alameda, Long Beach, or Honolulu. And you had mentioned earlier about a crisis in housing. I would like to suggest to you that one of the results we've had after our 2-month research project is that we're in a position now, I think, to indicate to the community that maybe for the first time we really are beginning to get a handle on the housing crisis that has been so prevalent for so many years here. For example, if the Navy has a requirement for 1,140 housing units and we're able to entice or induce developers to build 2,000 or 3,000 housing units, it does 2 things. It obviously more than compensates for what we need for the Navy, but it also allows the Navy to take some of their families from the community where they're now out renting or purchasing housing units, maybe driving prices up, maybe not, but allows those military families now either to go on base or onto military housing, which will create more of a larger inventory in the community. So we would like to think that the community really will benefit by having a larger inventory of housing. Roy mentioned 6% of the water use by the Navy. It turns out the overall impact on the housing for the state or for the island is only 6% also. So the Navy per se has a relatively small impact on the community housing, so anything we can do to add more housing to that inventory will help the community at large.
Well, that sounds beautiful.
The 90% rule is for the military housing requirements for the island as a whole. There is no relationship between the 90% rule and the Navy's specific requirement for 1,140 housing units for the Battleship Surface Action Group. As a matter of fact, 1,140 is for just the number of ships that would be deployed or home ported here.
Right.
The 90% rule applies to the Army's control of the housing overall island-wide.
Right, I understand that, but we're not talking about only housing for the battleship group, right? We're talking about other ships that are going to be home ported here anyway, 2 of them, and we're talking about growing needs by the Army, by the Marines, by the Air Force as well, to a total of 4,250, right?
All right, let's look at that number. That's a true number, as far as an estimate, as far as projection. One of the success factors that the task force has had is that we have been able to work very closely with our congressional delegation, with the Army, with the Navy, almost as a catalyst to get them to look at a problem they kind of knew they had, but now we're able to bring it up to the surface, so to speak, and show them that if we can get the Army to apply for a waiver on the 90% rule, this would now allow the Army to go ahead on land that they already have and start building something like 2,500 to 3,000 housing units for military people. So even though they've had this 90% rule for years, which by the way is unique to Hawaii in the effect that we have about a 1.5% vacancy factor, whereas other communities on the mainland, they have a 4 to 6% vacancy factor. So the fact that we have more of a housing crisis here is now part of what we as the task force has been able to get the Army to become more aware of what their problem is.
Well, I'm glad you made them more aware.